you. So I know people are coming back from lunch, and I have nothing incredibly profound to say about spectrum, except that I think that spectrum policy will actually be one of the more profound things that our policymakers take up in the next year. There is a lot going on, probably, in Congress. There will be a lot going on in the FCC and at NTIA when the government gets back to work. And the people on this stage have a lot to say and represent varied viewpoints, but I think have some commonality, particularly when it comes to unlicensed, shared, and coordinated spectrum, which is what Wi-Fi Forward, the group that I represent, my name is Ellen Satterwhite, that's what we do and that's what we talk about. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Austin Bonner with Harris Wiltshire Grannis to introduce the rest of the panel, and thank you all for coming and being as interested in spectrum as I am. Austin.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. In the tradition of saving the best for last, we have saved the nerdiest spectrum nerds for the lunch hour. This is a group for whom I could spend an entire hour talking about their bios, so I'm just going to give you the bare bones, but I encourage you to look them up in your materials. At the far end is Claude Aiken. He's the president and CEO of WISPA, the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. After that, Michael Calabrese, who many of you know, the director of the Open Technology Institute at the New American Foundation, Andy Clegg, Spectrum Engineering lead at Google, and Bartlett Cleland, who, among many other roles, is the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at ALEC. If you consult Bartlett's bio, you'll also learn that he is a direct descendant of William Wallace.
Family.
Oh, okay. Nonetheless, little warlike tendencies today. So on today's theme of bipartisanship, I want to start with just sort of an open question. I think spectrum has a reputation for being a relatively nonpartisan issue. Michael, you're sort of a veteran of the spectrum wars of the last 20 years. What is it that you think about spectrum that makes it ripe for bipartisan consideration and problem solving?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. In fact, it always was. I think back, to mention an issue, that's familiar to people, TV white spaces. That's how I met Commissioner O'Reilly. Mike O'Reilly was a staffer for Senator Sununu, and he drafted, along with Senator Kerry's staffer, Danny Sepulveda, they drafted the bill to force the FCC to finish the TV white spaces proceeding, a decade ago. And the TV incentive auction was crafted, on the Hill on a very bipartisan basis to solve that dilemma about, how do you provide incentives when this Communications Act doesn't allow the commission to give money to incumbents. So it really should be, and there's really every incentive to do so, to make it nonpartisan, because the problems are nonpartisan. The digital divide, rural broadband, those are things that I think every member from every state is concerned about. The same thing with just simply having faster, more ubiquitous and affordable connectivity, because now, like electricity, is an input into everything in the economy. And so everyone has to be concerned about getting more of it out there any which way possible and just being pragmatic.
So picking up on that theme of closing the digital divide and rural development, Claude, I know you've done some congressional testimony over the last year about how these issues intersect with rural development. Where do you think the big opportunities are for this Congress?
Sure. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here. So, WISPA represents over 800, has over 800 members, most of which are small, rural, mostly unsubsidized fixed wireless providers. A lot of the conversation that we heard on the earlier panel focused on, we need to get infrastructure out there. But for our members, the critical infrastructure that they need in order to serve urban and rural America is spectrum. It'd be like telling a fiber provider they can't buy fiber and then need to go serve somewhere. So as Congress is thinking about infrastructure, as it's thinking about rural broadband, I think that spectrum is going to need to be a critical component of what we think about as we go into 2019, and as you continue to hear about the need to do something on infrastructure. I think spectrum would be a pretty key component of that.
Do others on the panel see other opportunities for rural development with spectrum?
Yeah, I know Claude's group, WISPA, has been very heavily involved in the new 3.5 gigahertz citizens broadband radio service, which is a great opportunity for both urban and rural broadband deployments. It's going to add a lot of capacity, fill-in capacity for urban systems. It's a great complement to 5G. But in the rural areas, so the wireless internet service providers have had access to a portion of what is now becoming the 3.5 gigahertz CBRS band. And once that CBRS band is open for commercial service, which we're hoping will be the case in the first half of this year, they will have access to even more spectrum than they used to. They used to have access to 50 megahertz in the band. Now they will have access to up to 150 megahertz, depending on the area. And so we see CBRS as not just being a great expansion of broadband opportunities everywhere, but a particularly good expansion of broadband opportunities in rural areas.
So Andy, one of the things that's been important to the CBRS debate is the sharing mechanism.
Right.
Sharing represents an opportunity to have a sort of a non-zero sum spectrum discussion.
Right.
Looking ahead, do you think sharing is going to be a big bipartisan theme for the coming spectrum debates this year or next year?
So I think it is. The last three presidents, the current president and the previous two from both parties, have issued spectrum memorandum, beginning with George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and now President Trump. And both parties have looked at spectrum sharing as a way to improve the efficiency with which we use spectrum, and also gain access to more spectrum that we wouldn't otherwise have opportunities to access. And at the same time, our technical capabilities in like cloud-based computing, artificial intelligence, the amount of geodata we have to better understand things that might impede radio propagation or paths that might be good for radio propagation. All of these things, the political interest in spectrum sharing and the development of the technical capabilities, I think are coming together at the same time. And the CBRS, I think, is the first, very, very complex spectrum sharing arrangement that we've been able to bring to market, or we will bring to market very soon. And my feeling is, given the complexity of sharing spectrum with the federal government and their radars and stuff like that, if we make CBRS work, which it will, I guarantee you, we're pretty deeply involved in that, it will be easy to bring spectrum sharing to other bands that are less challenging. And we're really looking forward to doing that. I think, between millimeter wave bands, 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz of C-band, maybe even the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band that's been talked about, which is currently a government band. I think there's lots of opportunities out there, and I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of spectrum sharing opportunities.
In fact, sort of tying these 2 points together about the, increasing bipartisan support for sharing underutilized bands with the imperative for rural broadband. Because 5G initially is going to be an urban intersuburban phenomenon, but we still have more than 25 million, people out there without real broadband at all. But tying them together, I think where CBRS is, as a proof point, is going to have a huge payoff is that band that Andy mentioned that's immediately above it, the C band from 3.7 to 4.2. Because not only is it right next door to CBRS, where both mobile carriers and fixed wireless providers like WISP will be deploying, it's not only contiguous, but it's an enormous amount of spectrum. And although the commission, the FCC, is trying to clear a portion of the band up from the bottom for exclusive licensing, most of the band will continue on for fixed satellite service, where kind of the Earth stations scattered around the country are using it, but most of the capacity is unused. And so a kind of a very simplified form of the spectrum access system that governs CBRS can be used to allow shared use of that band on a local basis to hit all those homes in the outer, in the exurbs, in the small towns, in the rural areas. And that's going to be a huge thing that ought to be popular, across the spectrum, political spectrum, that is.
I just wanted to add a note on the economic side to, I guess, set some of the tone for the debate. There will be no endpoint to this. And I think everyone is saying that. I know you all believe that and understand that. There's a really good economic reason. It's called Say's law, and that is supply creates its own demand, and roughly. And that is what will happen. So as we clear these bands, as we get more spectrum available, I honestly can't think of anything more important for the future of technology, honestly, than getting more spectrum available. It's a finite resource, ultimately. We will have to become more efficient in its use. And so some of these debates, I think, come down to that. We can quibble over how you're going to do it, but ultimately you have to get there. And so whatever mechanism, there are some nice juicy chunks sitting out there that should be relatively easy to figure out a solution for, some of which I think we'll get to later. But we have to remember there is no end to this, and so if you haven't begun to think about this challenge, if you really are invested in a world of tomorrow with technology and communications, then this has to be a priority issue.
So I think that economic piece is important and one that we ought to pause on for a moment. Policymakers, I think, have applied a lot of different economic lenses to thinking about spectrum. Auction revenue is an obvious one. What are some other economic considerations that ought to have some bipartisan agreement around them?
Well, I'll go a little deeper on your auction. I'm not sure that anyone disagrees with the approach to auctioning. I mean, these airwaves are ours, right? We have an FCC that handles how those airwaves get used for our benefit. And the notion of locking them up or giving them to entities that don't have U.S. interests, say, as kind of their central thinking, seems to be anathema to why we do this. In addition, then, or the way we get compensation for it, so to speak, is funds for the government, sort of an indirect. But we also get the innovation on the backside, which I would give credit to the individual companies that are creating those technologies and delivering them to us. But that's the way it all works, and that's the foundation of how the economic system within spectrum policy operates. And I think that's critically important, and I honestly don't know a soul who disagrees with that approach.
Well, there's also different types of auctions. So like a couple of thoughts is I still remember Reed Hunt, when he was FCC chair, of course, he proposed and ran the first spectrum auctions that were designed for to get mobile service going. I guess that was 1G. But one thing he said, I wish we could have collected beads instead of money. Wish it could bid beads, because every time you have one of these big auctions, it sucks money out of the telecom sector that might have been used for capital investment. So there's certainly a good reason for the auctions, but they shouldn't be about raising money for the government primarily. And the other thing is that they shouldn't be designed with some idea of maximizing revenue. So, for example, now we're starting to see, some of these prior auctions were designed specifically to get spectrum set up just to meet the specific business models of big mobile carriers. But now there's thousands of parties, thousands of other companies and small ISPs, individual enterprises, community anchor institutions, venues, like from sports stadiums to hospitals and everything that want spectrum. Now that it's all about very high capacity local area networks for Internet of Things, and so really, even if you use an auction mechanism, you want to make sure that there's a balance, that you have a lot of small area spectrum, really affordable blocks of spectrum that lots of different players can purchase so that they can innovate, so that they can compete, so that they can serve rural America, for example. So a lot of it's how you do it and what the end game is.
Completely agree. It's about efficient allocation of resources. Auction is just the tool for doing that.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree that there are a variety of different ways that you can look at this issue. I mean, for example, if you look at the past couple years and the spectrum auctions that have been undertaken, you know, broadcast incentive auction, things of that nature, we've had less net revenue to the Treasury over that time period than we have spent on subsidizing rural broadband. So, you know, I think another perspective that we can potentially take here is to think about, you know, spectrum as a potential lever. You know, obviously we want to put spectrum to its best and highest use regardless of the context. And, you know, historically we've kind of thought about it in licensed and unlicensed buckets, you know, sharing. And as Andy was saying, the technology is going to be enabling more of that going forward. So I think that's something that we should look at more closely. But, you know, I think we need to make sure that we are indeed putting spectrum to its best and highest use, and not you know, favoring one business model over another. And, you know, hindsight is 20/20 a lot of times, because, you know, I hear from our members all the time who say, you know, there's that band right over there, no one's using it in my area, you know, X, Y, or Z large company has an exclusive license to that. I'm dying out here. I'm maxed out. I've got potential customers within reach of my tower. If I just had access to that, I could provide great service. And, you know, the rules prohibited that. So I think we need to, you know, think long term. We need to think, you know, in an innovation maximizing way about spectrum, and, you know, continue to iterate on our policy.
So, Claude, you mentioned the unlicensed spectrum auction, which I know is something all four of you have spent a lot of time thinking about. Here, the economic contribution is maybe a little more complicated to get your arms around, because there's not an auction result that puts a value on that spectrum. How should we think about what unlicensed spectrum is worth to the economy?
So I think one of the ways that we can think about that is just in terms of economic activity generated. I think that's probably the most commonly used metric for, you know, economic studies on spectrum. You know, fixed wireless is certainly a part of that, because a lot of our members will use unlicensed spectrum in order to be able to provide rural broadband. But, you know, you're talking about Wi-Fi, you're talking about metering, you're talking about a lot of different things that unlicensed will enable, and all of the economic activity that's generated around those things. So I think that's a pretty common way of thinking about valuation in the terms of unlicensed spectrum.
Which is, you know, which of course is why Wi-Fi Forward, I think just, you know, last year updated its study on the economic value of unlicensed spectrum, and it's north of $200 billion a year. And that should be pretty obvious to all of us when you think that, for example, on these devices, that 70 to 80% of all the mobile device data traffic is going a short distance over unlicensed spectrum, over the public spectrum, and it's not touching whoever you're paying $100 or $200 a month to for your service. It's not touching their spectrum, it's not touching their towers or their network at all. This is, you know, what Wi-Fi is carrying most of the traffic, and allows us all to have kind of one router, you know, at home, at work, whatever, and then just get, you know, everything to every device over the air.
I also think that, you know, unlicensed is obviously a big part of our economy. You know, so many people use Wi-Fi and other unlicensed services, Bluetooth. But I think there's a role both for unlicensed and licensed spectrum. You know, when you need a guarantee of quality of service or something like that, for example, for broadband delivery, having licensed spectrum that's, you know, controlled by a single operator may not be a bad idea. Having access to unlicensed spectrum so you're not having to pay for it, and living with the potential disruption due to, you know, quality of service issues is also valuable. In the CBRS band, coming back to that again, the 3.5 gigahertz band, we're sort of experimenting with both sides of that equation. There is 2 tiers of licenses that you can get in the CBRS band. One gives you protection from other users, so you can sort of guarantee better quality of service for your own customers or users. And then another one basically makes use of whatever the other tier isn't using. And so you're not guaranteed that you won't be interfered with, but you have access to up to 150 megahertz of spectrum depending on where the priority users are. Now, both of those are technically licensed. That lower tier is not unlicensed, it's lightly licensed, but it is sort of that experiment there in one band with both guaranteeing a quality of service with an actual, purchased, auctioned license, and also experimenting with just opportunistic access to spectrum with no guarantee of quality. And we're seeing tremendous interest, even among major carriers, in that lower tier of spectrum. One reason is it's going to be available sooner, but in general, even if you take out that part of the equation, there's a tremendous amount of interest in what can we do with up to 150 megahertz of lightly licensed spectrum that we don't have to pay for. And we're willing to deal with some uncertainty. But in those areas where we absolutely have to guarantee service to our customers or our users, we're willing to go after the higher tier thing. So it's interesting. We'll see, as CBRS develops, we'll see what is sort of which one ends up being more in demand, the priority access license that you pay for and get quality of service, or how many people will go for the lower tier and be happy with just opportunistic access.
I think the value of the unlicensed is summed up, and you guys will probably remember who said it. I think it was a CEO of a cable company, said something along the lines of, we're not in the cable business, we're in the Wi-Fi business. And I think that sums up the value of Wi-Fi. It is what, certainly in my household, and I know statistically, what most people are using, and they're using it all the time. So you're right, the value to the citizenry ultimately cannot be minimized in the value of Wi-Fi, unlicensed, I'm sorry.
So Bartlett, I want to ask you specifically, thinking about this from a conservatively economic-minded approach.
What makes you think I'm conservative?
I think
Sorry,
you told
go
me. I'm interested to know, there's a way of viewing unlicensed access as sort of fundamentally deregulatory. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think you're talking about the value of unlicensed, right? And the framework that's created around unlicensed. And without diving into specifics, because I'm not sure they're particularly helpful, the notion is that you set a framework of rules, usually very light touch rules, and let industry go at being able to deliver their best and brightest technologies to folks who want it. As opposed to, as you go to the higher bands that, where people are bidding on, that might come laden with a whole lot of rules. Arguably, I'm not sure I've seen a definitive study on this, but certainly arguably, you've seen a lot of growth, exponential growth, in what used to be called junk bands. Anyone remember that? These were junk bands. This junk turned into be some of the most valuable bands out there by a lot of different metrics. And I think that has a lot to do with the conditions that have been placed, or lack thereof, in auctions, and letting the marketplace speak to what the rules of the road are.
It was, it was just, couldn't help but
Did you Google it? No.
piping in that they were considered, junk bands, right? So where Wi-Fi grew up, initially on 2.4 gigahertz, we also used for our microwave ovens, for example, because there was this notion, and I still remember in the early days of fighting for Wi-Fi, a decade ago or more, everyone kept saying, "Oh, we're going to run headlong into the tragedy of the commons," right? That this is going to be like too many sheep grazing, too many users on Wi-Fi, and but then that just becomes an incentive to design the technology around it. And sure, if you're in the airport, and especially if you're on 2.4, which is pretty much exhausted, you will slow down, but you're not blocked. And in most places, it works just great, and it's been proven far more resilient and to have far much more capacity than anyone would ever have expected. And the same, I think, will be true with CBRS, as Andy described, that GAA spectrum, the unlicensed, what I would consider to be the kind of the, well, it's lightly licensed technically, but the unlicensed portion of the citizens broadband service, general authorized access. I think, you know, that will turn out to have more economic value even than the licensed portion.
Michael, you mentioned the exhaustion point that we're reaching in the 2.4 gigahertz band. It's been a long time, maybe 20 years since there's been new mid-band spectrum for unlicensed access. Do you all see some bipartisan opportunities to work on that spectrum crunch problem in the coming years?
Yes, I mean, actually, this FCC is giving, you know, really strong signals that it is adopting kind of the, you know, what's become on Capitol Hill a bipartisan consensus to have a sufficient amount of both licensed and unlicensed. So there is, you know, currently pending, well, the commission adopted I believe in October, a notice of proposed rulemaking to allow sharing of the 6 gigahertz band. Which is up to 1,200 megahertz of spectrum, an enormous amount of spectrum. It has lots of incumbents in it, but there are technical ways you can share that band for unlicensed use, and which is critically important because even if the 2.4 gigahertz band wasn't so overcrowded, it also doesn't keep pace with 5G because it's 20 megahertz channels, and what you need today are 80 megahertz channels and even 160 megahertz channels for gigabit Wi-Fi. Cable companies are bringing gigabit to every one of their customers' homes, and so that means your Wi-Fi router needs gigabit connectivity, and the current unlicensed spectrum doesn't provide that. So the bottleneck has flipped. The bottleneck is now not your commercial broadband service, as long as you have a fixed line, some kind of fiber or cable. You'll probably be able to pay for a gigabit of service if you want it. The shortage now is in your Wi-Fi router because it can't pipe that kind of capacity around your house without more unlicensed spectrum. The other band we could talk about more separately is the 5.9 gigahertz band, which connects the primary, what's increasingly becoming the primary band for unlicensed is 5 gigahertz, and now the FCC is looking at 6 above that, but sort of the roadblock in this potential Wi-Fi superhighway is this 5.9, 75 megahertz that's completely vacant because the auto industry's been sitting on it for 20 years.
Can I underscore that? So this is one of my hobby horses. Michael and I have actually both addressed this in other places. This band has been locked up by the Transportation Department since, I think it's 20 years this year, 1999. And nothing has happened. It doesn't mean they didn't try, doesn't mean they didn't have a good run, doesn't mean any of that. But it strikes me that after 20 years, particularly in, I'll go to the tech industry, because that's where I originate from, but I suspect the telephonic communications industry would say something similar. 20 years is a really, really, really long time to have locked up basic infrastructure. And it's time to let that go. There have been various proposals that have suggested other means of locking it up, so to speak, prioritizing it for transportation, safety, et cetera. We heard earlier, I think on the first panel, folks talk about how transportation has gone a completely different direction. That's true here. We're not all going to operate, it seems, off of having a connection to Wi-Fi because you get to that area of the country where there isn't any, and boom, you have no automobile, or you have no safety, or you have no whatever has been built into that vehicle. So it's time to go. Proposals have been made in the last 2 administrations. Nothing, I'm sure, in this administration, in the previous, it's time to send a message, honestly, hopefully the White House to the Department of Transportation, that it's time to let go of that band.
So I would add that, wholehearted agreement on 5.9 and 6 gigahertz. Those are prime unlicensed bands that we could be utilizing, not only for Wi-Fi, but also for rural broadband, and you could unlock a lot of potential there, but also that details matter. So, Bart, you were talking about, unlicensed being one of the great deregulatory mechanisms. But if you muck around with things like power limits, you could effectively make one or more of those bands a Wi-Fi only band and not enable the kind of use in rural areas that you otherwise would see, and thereby dampen other potential economic activity and efforts to close the digital divide. So just, I think we're all in violent agreement, but just putting a flag up, the details do matter.
So it wouldn't be a spectrum panel if we didn't talk about 5G. Andy, I wonder if you can kick us off with what are some of the major questions policymakers ought to be asking themselves now when we're sort of starting out or near the first half of the road to 5G?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, I'm not sure if any two people will agree at exactly what 5G is. I think we're getting closer to defining it, but we're sort of defining it after the fact as we start to deploy and say, well, this is 5G or 5GE or whatever. I think one of the prime motivators behind 5G is more bandwidth to more people is really what we're looking at in 5G. We're trying to converge where it's no longer, a mobile device or a fixed device, but the ability for operators to provide very high bandwidth, very high speed signals in either a mobile or a fixed environment. And for the purpose of the carriers, you need to be able to do that affordably. And for the benefit of the users, you want to be able to do it reliably and allow devices that have long battery life and things like that. So in the end, 5G from a technical perspective means moving towards larger swaths of spectrum, and also densifying the deployment so that each individual base station, for example, is serving a smaller area. That way you can get more data to fewer people with that one base station and then just get more capacity by putting on a lot more base stations. So the 5G characteristic is the cells are going to shrink, the bandwidths are going to expand. And at the moment, millimeter wave spectrum is where that's playing out because we have more, not completely clear spectrum, but we have more spectrum to work with. The signals naturally propagate less distance at millimeter wave because buildings and trees and other things are more impediments at millimeter wave than they are at the lower frequencies. So what we're seeing now is sort of the first concept of 5G playing out in millimeter wave spectrum. But I think as we develop good spectrum sharing technologies, some of those characteristics can be applied even to lower frequency bands. What we're talking about with sharing 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed, and Google is a proponent of that, as well as many others. That's almost like a gigahertz of contiguous spectrum at a relatively low frequency, which is almost unheard of. And so it offers the opportunity to provide a lot of bandwidth there. I think, speaking more personally than anything else, I think there's going to be some challenges at 6 gigahertz. There's a lot of incumbents there, and you've got to work around them. You've got to protect them. Some of them are critical infrastructure operators. But it's an example of, where 5G can be deployed, not just at millimeter wave. And I think millimeter wave is going to be a little bit of a challenge. There's going to be some hurdles to overcome. I think the early 5G millimeter wave deployments are going to have some growing pains. But 6 gigahertz is an opportunity to potentially look at, this concept of 5G providing more bandwidth to more people at a lower frequency. And potentially, as we develop our spectrum sharing capabilities, we might be able to even press to lower frequencies. There's some benefits. The devices are cheaper, battery power, they're more power efficient, so batteries last longer, things like that. But I think, coming up, I think as 5G develops, we'll see it sort of move from millimeter wave down to lower frequencies as we develop better spectrum sharing capabilities.
I also add, that I think it's important to consider, don't get, caught up too much in the hype about a race to 5G, particularly concerning mobile, because one of the most fundamental things is that 5G is not just another G. So we did move from 2G to 3G to 4G as mobile technologies, but 5G isn't just or even perhaps primarily a mobile technology. In the end, it's I like to think of it more as an ecosystem. And as Andy described, the base stations, right, the backhaul has to be very close to the end users. So it's premised on convergence between fixed and mobile. And you see that because, for example, Verizon, when they announced last year that the first, major stage of 5G for them is fixed wireless, to reach to bring high capacity to an additional 32 million homes. It's only going to be in urban and inner suburban areas in the top 100 MSAs, and there's no mobile. It's just fixed wireless. They can bring fiber to, say, an intersection and then hit homes. And, WISPs and rural carriers are proposing to do the same thing, out in the exurbs and rural areas if they get the right spectrum. And then on top of that will come mobile, but you have to bring the high capacity close to the end user first. The other tension is it's not just ISPs. What we think of today's ISP, why? Mainly because what I mentioned earlier, as you introduce the Internet of Things, as you want everything to be connected, particularly indoors, then all these individual enterprises and community anchor institutions and venues have the incentive to simply deploy their own network, their own internal 5G network, and if they have, for example, the CBRS spectrum to do that, and perhaps more spectrum in the future, they certainly have unlicensed, then they can connect to the external mobile 5G network or to backhaul provided by a cable company or someone. But ultimately, the 5G ecosystem is going to be much more heterogeneous and much more convergent in terms of fixed and mobile.
So I would add that, I think from our perspective, we don't want to see 5G used as a stalking horse for favoring one particular type of deployment, one particular type of company. I mean, just recently, Verizon publicly said that they have all the spectrum they need for their 5G deployments. And meanwhile, we're still having these kind of spectrum discussions at the FCC and before Congress on making this critical infrastructure available for broad use as we're talking about here, and particularly coming from the perspective of an association where the large majority of our members are rural. We have to remember those Americans who, to this day, don't have 5G, don't have 4G, don't have 3G, but have no G. And the companies that are looking to solve that issue, CBRS is a good example, and one issue where we were pretty vocal on the need for smaller license sizes that make deployment and economic sense for smaller entities to be able to acquire the lightly licensed priority access licenses. The FCC made its decision, and the majority of our providers, our members, will no longer be able to bid on those licenses just because it doesn't make economic or business sense for them to do so. But we have to be cognizant of the message about this race to 5G, that we're taking a big picture look. That as Michael was saying, it's not just mobile, it's not just the big mobile carriers. It's an entire ecosystem of innovators and entrepreneurs who want to take advantage of spectrum to either provide broadband where there isn't any, to provide innovative services where they haven't been able to do so before, and we need to look inclusively at all of that and design policies to enable all of that use.
I want to underscore that point. Government policy done wrong is going to pick winners and losers, broadly speaking. Government policy in this space done right is going to enable the industry, the ecosystem, better word, the ecosystem to move forward. And that doesn't mean that it's his members or other carriers, it means whoever can provide the best product to the most people at the best price will win. And that is what government should be cheering on, not picking winners and losers. So to the extent that policies are being made to exclude, I think we should look for greater inclusion in the way whatever those policies are being set up.
So speaking of new technology standards, there's also a new Wi-Fi standard, Wi-Fi 6. What are the big spectrum considerations you see for making Wi-Fi 6 a reality? Michael, Andy, anyone can start on this one.
Start with hopefully the short answer, which is, the thing about Wi-Fi 6, which I think we mentioned earlier with respect to the importance of getting access to 5.9 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz, is that you can have these really wide channels. Because Wi-Fi today is, premised on 20 megahertz channels almost entirely, which is not enough capacity to continue to be the complement to, for example, licensed 5G, So if mobile carriers, like I said, if it's an 80-20 ratio, I don't know if it will always be, but if you can get this real high capacity from your mobile carrier someday, and then you walk into your home or your office or Starbucks, where of course you want to keep your prices down by getting onto Wi-Fi, you want to have the high capacity for Wi-Fi as well. You want 4K video on your tablet or your smartphone. So to do that, you need wide channels, and that's what this Wi-Fi 6, which I believe corresponds to 802.11ax, right?
I, for one, welcome the opportunity to stop typing 802.11ax.
Yeah, all these .a something, AC to AX, but as we get there, it's premised on these much bigger channels, 80 to 160 megahertz, which can give you gigabit throughput from your router to certain devices, probably to laptops in the not too distant future, but you need to be able to spread those bits over wide contiguous channels. So that's the main difference. It's going to enable 5G type performance on Wi-Fi.
I would just remark the 3GPP crowd is not comfortable admitting this, and the Wi-Fi crowd is not comfortable admitting this, but the two are coming together. And I think, my prediction is 20 years from now, there won't be any significant difference between macro, LTE and 5G NR and that type of base technology and Wi-Fi technology. I'll probably get in trouble for saying something like that, but that's what
Well, we've got just a few minutes left. Are we ready to take some questions from Twitter or the audience? Harold?
So, I'm curious for anybody, what, if anything, should we draw from the fact that the first 5G auction, which was announced with considerable fanfare, is clocking in at less than $700 million in terms of total auction revenue? I mean, is there something in particular, is that, not indicative of anything, or is there something that we ought to be paying attention to there?
So we're not involved in the auction, obviously, but I think, I don't want to comment directly on, the auction revenue so far or the potential auction revenue so far, but I think it's related to the fact that I think anything at millimeter wave it's more than experimental now, but I think, no one's proved that a commercial broadband service can operate at millimeter wave frequencies. And I think that could have some impact on the amount of money they're willing to bid for the spectrum.
Yeah, and I would add, I think it reflects at least two things. One, that Verizon already had a lock on this band from its acquisition of Straight Path. And so a carrier, again, just like Wi-Fi, they want these big wide channels if they're going to use a band. And so there's probably only room for one carrier on that band to really economically use it for network densification, and so nobody else is going to really, pay up against them. But the flip side is along the lines of what Andy said, is that the building out based on millimeter wave. I mean, I think it's just really overrated at this point, which is why we're going to have such big battles over mid-band spectrum, because the CapEx and the OpEx involved in densifying your network by relying almost entirely on millimeter wave spectrum is just enormous and unproven.
Yeah, and I shouldn't have said nobody's done it. I mean, there have been, years and years ago, LMDS deployments. Starry is now apparently successfully doing some deployments in the band. It's not that nobody has done it, it just hasn't been done on the scale of broadband deployments in, lower frequency spectrum. And so I think it's not exactly clear how valuable the spectrum is yet until you prove that this can work economically and on a grand scale.
So I would add to that. So full disclosure, we do have a couple of members who have filed to participate in that auction. But I think it also, not directly on the revenues perspective, but maybe it is. But when you're auctioning off spectrum, that sort of the max distance it can travel at best is a couple of miles at partial economic area levels, which can be massive areas. You're picking the particular kind of entity that can actually participate in those auctions, and it's not small businesses and it's not entrepreneurs. So my personal view is that potentially could have a role in depressing revenue from this auction.
Other questions? I think we've got one in the back over here.
With the decline of revenue from cable franchise agreements in cities, with that funding not being channeled to digital inclusion programs and community media programs, what are the opportunities that you see in the 5G build-out for public interest?
I didn't hear the end of that. Could you read?
I think our question is, since cities are getting less revenue from cable franchise agreements, are there opportunities in the 5G build-out to gather some of that revenue that has been channeled toward digital inclusion programs by cities in the past?
Well, I mean, I guess stick my neck out for starters is I think that's what the FCC was afraid of to a degree when they clamped down on that last year and passed an order, limiting, not only putting a shot clock on approvals of network siting for 5G, but also defining kind of a reasonable fee as not including anything like that. So at least this FCC would put the kibosh on any efforts to treat 5G deployment as if it was anything like a cable franchise and to try to get money for a different purpose.
Let me do my very best at being moderate. William Wallace's sister, by the way. I'm not sure she was quite as feisty. It seems very premature to me to be having a conversation about layering fees and taxes on a technology that has not rolled out yet. We don't know how it's going to roll out. We don't know where it's going to roll out. We don't know to what extent it will become part of the ecosystem ultimately. I mean, just this week, I think we weren't going to mention this, I'll just mention it in passing. Just this week, or whatever week I'm in last week, at the Consumer Electronics Show, cable industry announces 10G. They have no date or horizon for that, but the point is something is coming, whether it's that or something else. And it strikes me that this is a peculiar time to be interested in putting a lot of economic weight on technology that has yet to roll out.
I think we have time for one more question. Well, seeing none from the audience, I'll ask it. Oh, hey, here we go.
So a bit of a philosophical, but a very practical question too. Since wireless spectrum is essentially, well, it's everywhere, but essentially a localized resource, why don't cities, counties, other local entities essentially have any say whatsoever in how it's used and how it's regulated?
Because the law forbids that?
What he said.
Yeah, I mean, back in, I think it was roughly 1925, the Federal Radio Act declared it's a national resource, owned by the public. And that's actually proven, I mean, putting aside your question, it's proven quite beneficial that even when you buy a license, pay for a license, it's temporary, and the Commission for Public Interest Reasons can modify licenses, can take them away, can move people around, and all that. And it was, it was just to avoid, I think, avoid balkanization, which doesn't mean that municipalities should not have access to spectrum. I mean, that's yet another reason. I mentioned community anchor institutions. It's another reason you want to have some share of spectrum, a diversity of spectrum access. So some share of spectrum that is small licensing areas or unlicensed, so that it can be used by schools and libraries and hospitals and so on, ports. So that there's certainly a good rationale for having access to it, but probably just having ownership of it would end up having it be used as inefficiently as the military is using spectrum, which is why CBRS, for example, is sharing the Navy band. But look at how long it takes and how hard it is.
And with that, I see that our time has expired. Will you join me in thanking our panel?